Topic 45, the New Deal, 1933 to 38. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to define the New Deal, identify and describe at least 3 New Deal programs, analyze how the New Deal changed the federal government and its relationship with the American people, identify critics and explain various critiques of the New Deal, and finally assess the efficacy of the New Deal in solving the problems of the Great Depression. Elected during the depths of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the White House in 1933 with a mandate to alleviate American suffering. After reassuring them in his first inaugural address that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, FDR and the Congress passed extraordinary legislation that re-envisioned the role of the federal government. Gone were the days of laissez-faire government. Between 1933 and 1938, the New Deal's laws, programs, and agencies used and enlarged the power of the federal government to provide relief to the poor and unemployed, recovery to the economy to stimulate job growth and consumer demand, and reform of the financial and banking systems to prevent another catastrophe like the Great Depression in the future. So many of the New Deal's signature laws were passed within the first 3 months or so of FDR's presidency that this period, the first 100 days, has become a benchmark of new presidents' effectiveness since 1933. Let's take a look at some of the most influential programs of the entire New Deal. By 1933, about 1/4 of the United States workforce was unemployed. The Great Depression hit particularly hard those Americans who had been vulnerable prior to 1929, such as the elderly and the rural poor. The New Deal's relief programs were designed to address the needs of these constituencies. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, employed young men between the ages of 18 and 25, putting them to work in preserving and beautifying the nation's natural landscapes. They created trails in national parks, fortified seashores, planted trees, all for $30 per month, 25 of which was sent back to their families. While working for the CCC, these young men slept in dormitories that they built and received 3 meals a day, on average putting 12 pounds on their skinny frames. Likewise, the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, put everyone from builders to painters to work creating and improving critical infrastructure and beautifying public spaces. Drive north along the FDR Drive, begun during the president's first year in office, over the Triborough Bridge to LaGuardia Airport, named for New York's mayor from 1934 to 45, and you will have traveled on or to just 3 of the city's many public works completed with New Deal funds. Inside LaGuardia's Marine Air Terminal, you'll see murals covering the walls. Not only did such projects provide employment to out-of-work artists, but they also conveyed the belief that everyday Americans deserve to see, hear, and experience great art. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 was one of the most famous, or infamous, programs that fell under the rubric of the New Deal programs for recovery of the economy. The NRA, as it was commonly known, established conditions for fair competition among businesses, regulated conditions for workers, and protected their rights to unionize. While the Supreme Court case Schechter Poultry Corp. Struck down the NRA as unconstitutional in 1935, its provisions permitting workers to collectively bargain with their employers were resurrected as Section 7A of the Wagner Act later that year. These legal protections of workers led to many strikes, especially in the auto and steel industries during the New Deal, which enabled labor unions to achieve solidly middle-class existences for many of their members by mid-century. Nevertheless, the industrial sector only recovered its vibrancy of the 1920s when the needs of the United States and its allies during World War II stimulated production. Moreover, consumer demand among civilians did not fully recover until after the war's end, leaving many to question the efficacy of the New Deal. Reform efforts during the New Deal often focused on fixing the nation's banking and financial sectors. The Glass-Steagall Act, for example, prohibited commercial banks from combining with investment banks. This law was repealed in 1999, which many believe led to the recession of 2008. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 attempted to prevent future stock market crashes by regulating the way that stocks were sold in the U.S. In all, the many programs and alphabet soup agencies that the New Deal established drastically increased the size of the federal government. In doing so, they broadened the role of government in Americans' lives. The New Deal promoted a vision of a government responsible for the well-being of its citizens, both in providing directly for their relief from suffering and in regulating corporate activities that might harm the nation's overall economic health. Though this vision of an activist, regulatory federal government was not without its critics, business interest on the right criticized the New Deal as socialism. They disagreed with the fundamental premise of how the New Deal was paid for, that money raised through taxing the rich or through borrowing would be redistributed to the poor in the form of jobs programs or, in the case of Social Security, a monthly payment. Their opposition to high taxes on the rich is comprehensible to modern ears. But today, when the U.S. debt stands at more than $19 trillion, their reluctance to spend more than the government took in through taxes might seem odd. However, this principle, known as deficit spending, was new in the 1930s. Led by the British economist John Maynard Keynes, deficit spending advocates argue that in times of low consumer demand, such as the Great Depression, the government must jumpstart the economy by pouring money into it, or rather, into citizens' hands, through programs such as those instituted by the New Deal. The adherents of Keynesianism theorize that once consumers possess enough money, the economy will revive on its own and government can back off from its artificial stimulation. However, when the economy did begin to show signs of recovery in late 1935, FDR presented Congress with a balanced budget in 1936, only to be faced with another mini-recession. Proponents of Keynesianism would argue that the New Deal stimulus hadn't been in place long enough to prevent such a backslide. But critics of the New Deal, and of deficit spending in general, countered that the mini-recession of 1937 proved that these programs were ineffective and not worth the debt that the U.S. took on in order to sustain them. FDR also faced challenges from within his own party. Critics like Louisiana former Governor and Senator Huey Long contended that the New Deal's assistance to the poor did not go far enough. Long's Share Our Wealth program proposed to make every man a king by even higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy. Though Long himself was assassinated in 1935, the enduring poverty throughout the decade provided ample fodder for critics to the left of FDR to push him to expand the New Deal further. Ultimately, both critiques of FDR and the New Deal contain some measure of truth. The Great Depression was not ended by the New Deal. It was ended by the increased wartime production of the early 1940s. In spite of deficit spending, many Americans remained mired in poverty. Nevertheless, while it may have been imperfect and incomplete, the New Deal did provide millions of Americans with jobs. It did expand the national infrastructure and preserve countless acres of American landscape. It did alter the banking and financial systems, making them more accountable and transparent. And it did promote a system that valued workers and the common man. Moreover, through his responsive leadership and skillful communication, Franklin Delano Roosevelt provided Americans with something they all needed during the dark days of the Great Depression: hope. Let's end this podcast by listening to some of those words of hope, just as Americans did almost a century ago.
Of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Here was this aristocrat from Dutchess County, confined to a wheelchair, Harvard educated, but because of his almost innate sense of communication skills and the medium of radio, he was transported into the living rooms of almost every home in America. And in our household, FDR was a demigod. He was the voice that always gave them hope. My parents really worshiped FDR. And it was not just because of policies, they felt connected to him because of that great warm radio voice and that amazing ability that he had to speak directly to the fears and the hopes of the American people.
I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
FDR and the Great Depression and the New Deal was an amazing time because FDR was about establishing hope, trying to bring hope back to life for people that were caught in this unbelievably chaotic period of economic chaos and stress.
In a lot of ways, FDR was actually an extremely unlikely figure to become a sort of moral and visionary leader in the ways that he did. Now, I think there's a great myth of FDR that he came into office, the country rallied around him, and the Depression was eventually solved. But that's not true. FDR was hated passionately by large portions of the population, and yet he did something really significant in those first months. First of all, he acted, and he acted in significant ways, and he came in saying, we can whip this thing, and whether or not he quite did it in those first months, he brought dramatic new ideas to the table and really did upend a lot of assumptions and make the idea that change really was possible a reality in many ways.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
Well, anytime we examine the New Deal, the legislation that FDR initiated as swiftly as he took the oath of office, we have to put it in the context of what had come before. We'd had a run of Republican pro-business presidents of the United States. Herbert Hoover was one of them. Cal Coolidge was another one, obviously. FDR came along and determined that something much bolder was needed to save the country, to provide a kind of a lifeboat, if you will, legislatively. So the New Deal was a real upheaval of everything that had gone before. And interestingly, the Republicans in Congress were willing to go along because the country was in such desperate shape. the idea of Social Security or public works programs, the WPA, the various other agricultural programs, which became critically important to the restoration of American agriculture and the modernization of it. The Republicans were willing to try anything at that point because we were on the precipice. The entire country could have gone down, and almost did, from an economic point of view.
So, remember the learning objectives for this podcast. You should now be able to define the New Deal, identify and describe at least 3 New Deal programs, analyze how the New Deal changed the federal government and its relationship with the American people, identify critics and explain various critiques of the New Deal, and assess the efficacy of the New Deal in solving the problems of the Great Depression. Write out each one in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of this podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives above in written form.